My name is Blair, and I am 26 years old. Get out, you uneducated trash. My father screamed those words as my suitcase hit the snow-covered lawn of our Connecticut estate. You are a lowlife and a parasite. My mother chimed in, intentionally stomping her designer heel right through my laptop screen. They thought they were destroying my life and kicking out the family failure. They had no idea that the broken computer in the snow had just finalized a $36 million sale. I did not argue. I just smiled, turned my back, and walked away. Before I tell you how they ended up begging for my mercy exactly 1 week later, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members who underestimated your worth. The freezing December wind bit through my thin coat as I stared at the cracked screen of my laptop. William, my father, stood on the porch of the massive colonial house, his face purple with rage. He had built a moderately successful real estate development firm and firmly believed wealth dictated human value. You are 26 years old and still playing with cheap code in your bedroom while eating our food, William bellowed. You are nothing but uneducated trash. Diane, my mother, was aggressively kicking my scattered clothes into the dirty slush. You dropped out of your university computer science program 3 years ago. Diane shrieked, her voice echoing across the manicured neighborhood. You are an absolute embarrassment to this family. Why could you not be more like Sydney? Your sister is a high-powered real estate attorney closing million-dollar deals, and you are just a parasite draining our resources. I looked down at the shattered laptop casing. Diane thought she had just ruined my livelihood. She did not realize the proprietary financial technology algorithm I had spent 3 years building was already safely deployed on a secure cloud server. I did not shed a single tear or offer a single word of defense. Crying was for people who had something to lose. I had everything to gain. Before I could even zip up my damaged suitcase, a sleek black Porsche SUV aggressively pulled into the circular driveway, the tires intentionally spraying dirty snow onto my jeans. The driver's side door opened, and Trey stepped out. He was my 32-year-old African-American brother-in-law married to Sydney. Trey was a director at a private equity fund and carried himself with the unbearable arrogance of a man who loved spending other people's money. He adjusted his tailored wool coat, looked at me shivering on the lawn, and scoffed in disgust. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled $50 bill, and tossed it into a snowbank at my feet. "Call an Uber," Blair, Trey said, not even bothering to look me in the eye as he checked his gold watch. "Do not stand here crying and ruin the neighborhood's aesthetic. I have VIP investors arriving at this house tonight to fund your father's new commercial project. We need everything looking flawless, and a homeless dropout standing on the lawn does not fit the luxury vibe. Grab your trash and leave before I have the estate security physically remove you from the premises." I bent down, picked up the wet $50 bill, and slipped it into my pocket. I looked at Trey, then up at William and Diane watching me from the porch with expressions of pure contempt. I gave them a chillingly calm smile. "Have a wonderful evening," I said clearly. I grabbed the handle of my broken suitcase and walked down the long winding driveway without looking back once. I walked exactly 2 blocks down the icy street until I reached the main intersection. A heavily armored black SUV pulled up smoothly beside me. A driver in a crisp black suit immediately stepped out, took my damaged suitcase, and opened the rear door for me. I sank into the plush leather seat and let out a long breath as the heated interior warmed my freezing hands. I reached into my inner coat pocket and pulled out my new fully encrypted smartphone. I opened my secure banking application. A bright green notification popped up on the screen. Wire transfer successful. $36 million from Vanguard Tech. The very code my mother had just called uneducated trash had just made me richer than my entire family's generational wealth combined. They had spent years treating me like a burden, assuming my constant typing and refusal to attend their superficial country club dinners meant I was a lazy failure. In reality, I had been building an automated trading system that major Wall Street firms were practically killing each other to acquire. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was an incoming call from my newly appointed wealth manager, David. "Good evening, boss David," said, his tone entirely professional. "I am reviewing the daily operations for Apex Holdings, your new shell company. Something highly interesting just crossed my desk. Williams' real estate firm and Trey's private equity fund have just jointly applied for a $10 million emergency bridging loan from us." I raised an eyebrow, watching the snow fall outside the tinted windows of the SUV. A bridging loan. For what exactly? "They are severely over-leveraged," David explained. "They need the $10 million immediately to avoid defaulting on 3 major commercial builds, and they are using the primary residential estate in Connecticut as collateral. They were using the exact house they had just kicked me out of to secure a loan from my own company." My father and brother-in-law were desperate, peddling a false image of immense success while secretly begging for cash to stay afloat. I smiled coldly at my reflection in the dark window. "Approve the loan immediately, David," I instructed. "Give them the full $10 million today, but I want you to bury an immediate recall clause deep in the fine print. If we discover any fraudulent financial representations in their application, the entire loan is due instantly, and we seize the collateral without warning." "Consider it done," David replied. I ended the call and leaned back against the headrest. They thought they had discarded a useless family member. They had no idea they had just handed the keys to their entire empire directly to their worst nightmare. I stood motionless on the frozen grass, my eyes locked on the shattered pieces of my laptop screen sinking into the snow. The silence in my head was absolute, a sharp contrast to the furious breathing of my parents standing on the grand front porch above me. They honestly believed that destroying a piece of hardware had erased my entire future. They were completely unaware that just 30 minutes prior, the final algorithms of my proprietary trading software had been successfully deployed to an encrypted cloud server. The deal was finalized. My financial independence was permanently secured. I had absolutely nothing left to say to them. William crossed his arms over his cashmere sweater. His face still flushed a deep shade of purple from his screaming. He glared down at me as if I were a disease that had infected his perfect suburban fortress. He pointed a shaking finger at my damaged suitcase lying on its side in the slush, demanding I leave his property immediately. He reminded me yet again how my sister Sydney was closing commercial real estate deals every single week while I was nothing but a lazy, uneducated parasite. I remained perfectly silent, knowing that arguing with a man who measured human value entirely by country club memberships and corporate titles was a complete waste of breath. Before I could even reach down to gather my scattered winter clothes, the loud roar of an expensive engine shattered the quiet afternoon. A sleek jet-black Porsche Macan sped up the long circular driveway, taking the curve far too fast. The heavy tires hit a puddle of dirty, freezing slush, intentionally spraying icy water all over the legs of my jeans. The luxury SUV came to a sudden, aggressive halt right next to my belongings, the front tires crushing a few of my favorite shirts deep into the mud. The driver's side door swung open and Trey stepped out into the freezing air. At 32 years old, my African-American brother-in-law was the exact kind of man my parents worshipped. He was a notoriously arrogant director at a boutique private equity fund, and he wore his wealth like a weapon. Today he was dressed in a tailored charcoal topcoat, a silk tie, and a luxury watch that caught the pale winter sunlight. He closed the car door with a heavy thud and looked at the scene before him with an expression of profound disgust. Trey did not even look at me first. He immediately turned his attention to the porch, his face transforming into a mask of sycophantic charm as he addressed my parents. "William, Diane, I brought the preliminary contracts for the commercial build," Trey said, his voice loud and booming across the sprawling lawn. "The VIP investors are flying in from New York this evening. We are going to secure the $10 million funding for your new plaza project by midnight. Sydney is finalizing the legal paperwork at her office right now. We are going to make this family richer than ever before." William's rigid posture instantly relaxed. The rage melted from his face, replaced by a greedy, enthusiastic smile. "Excellent work, Trey," my father praised, clapping his hands together in anticipation. "That is exactly the kind of ambition and drive this family needs right now." Trey nodded, soaking up the validation like a sponge. Then he slowly turned his head and looked down at me, kneeling in the snow. The charm vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a cold, condescending sneer. He walked over his expensive leather shoes, crunching loudly on the ice, and stopped right in front of me. He looked at my ruined laptop, my cheap suitcase, and my muddy jeans. "What is this absolute mess?" Blair Trey asked, his tone dripping with unbridled contempt. "Are you finally getting kicked out of the house?" I stood up, brushing the wet dirt off my knees, and met his gaze evenly. "I am leaving," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady and clear. Trey let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed in the cold air. "It is about time. You have been dragging down this family's reputation for years. Sydney is embarrassed to even mention to her colleagues that she has a sister." He reached into the inner pocket of his designer coat and pulled out a silver money clip thick with cash. He peeled off a single bill, crumpled it into a tight ball in his fist, and tossed it carelessly at my feet. The crumpled $50 bill landed in a puddle of muddy snow right next to my broken laptop. "Call an Uber, Blair!" Trey ordered, pointing a manicured finger toward the exit of the neighborhood. "Do not stand here crying and ruin the neighborhood's aesthetic. I have high-profile VIP investors arriving at this house tonight to fund your father's new commercial project. These are serious, wealthy people who do not have time for sob stories. The absolute last thing we need is them pulling up to the estate and seeing a homeless dropout weeping on the front lawn. It is incredibly bad for business. Grab your trash, take the $50, and get out of our sight before I have the neighborhood security team physically drag you away." William and Diane watched from the porch, nodding in agreement with every cruel word Trey spoke. They expected me to break. They expected me to scream or beg or fall to my knees and cry about how unfair this treatment was. They desperately wanted the satisfaction of watching me shatter into pieces. I looked at the crumpled $50 bill soaking up the dirty water. Then I slowly bent down and picked it up. I carefully smoothed out the wrinkles, folded the wet paper in half, and slipped it into the front pocket of my jacket. I stood up straight, squared my shoulders, and looked directly into Trey's arrogant eyes. I did not frown. I did not glare. Instead, I gave him a chillingly calm, bright smile that seemed to catch him completely off guard. "Thank you for the travel money, Trey," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "Good luck with your VIP investors tonight. I am sure they will be very interested in your unique financial strategies." Trey blinked clearly, unsettled by my complete lack of distress. His jaw tightened, but before he could formulate another insult to hurl at me, I turned my back on him. I grabbed the handle of my damaged suitcase and began walking down the long, icy driveway. I did not look back at the sprawling estate. I did not look back at my parents, or the Porsche, or the brother-in-law, who thought he ruled the entire world. I just kept walking down the street, my calm smile never leaving my face. Trey thought his investors were the most powerful people in the state. He had absolutely no idea that the uneducated dropout he just threw $50 at had successfully closed a $36 million deal, and I was about to become the sole financier pulling the strings on his entire fraudulent empire. I kept walking down the icy pavement. The freezing Connecticut wind whipped against my face, slicing through my thin wool coat, but I barely registered the cold. My mind was entirely focused on the rhythm of my footsteps against the salted asphalt. One block, then another. I left the towering wrought iron gates of my parents' neighborhood behind, stepping out of their heavily manicured, highly leveraged world and into the real one. Exactly 2 blocks from the main intersection, tucked neatly beside a snowbank, a black armored SUV idled quietly. The engine purred with a low, powerful hum that commanded immediate attention. As I approached, the driver's side door opened instantly. Marcus, a highly trained private security contractor I had retained just 48 hours prior, stepped out onto the slushy curb. He wore a crisp, tailored black suit that remained completely unbothered by the freezing temperature. Without uttering a single word, he took the handle of my cracked, muddy suitcase, treating it with the utmost respect, and opened the heavy rear door for me. I climbed inside. The contrast was immediate and staggering. The interior of the SUV was a sanctuary of heated plush leather and absolute silence. The thick armored glass completely muted the howling wind and the distant sounds of suburban traffic. I sank back into the deep seat, letting the intense warmth thaw my stiff, freezing hands. Marcus closed the door with a solid, reassuring thud, effectively sealing me off from the life I had just left behind. He climbed into the driver's seat, glanced at me through the rearview mirror, and waited for my signal. I did not give him an address right away. Instead, I reached deep into the inner pocket of my coat and retrieved my secondary device. It was not the cheap cracked smartphone my family saw me carrying around the house. It was a high-end, fully encrypted terminal I used strictly for my development work. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The screen unlocked instantly, illuminating the dim cabin with a crisp white glow. I opened my secure banking application. A bright green banner dominated the top of the screen. Wire transfer successful. I stared at the numbers laid out in perfect, undeniable sequence. $36 million. The currency was verified, cleared, and sitting as pure, unencumbered liquid cash in my private accounts. The sender was Vanguard Tech, one of the most ruthless and aggressive financial technology conglomerates in Silicon Valley. I let out a slow, steady breath. The reality of those numbers began to settle into my bones. The software I had spent the last 3 years building in the dark isolation of my childhood bedroom was now the property of Vanguard. It was a proprietary high-frequency trading algorithm designed to anticipate micro-market fluctuations milliseconds before they registered on standard exchange feeds. It was complex, elegant, and brutally efficient. I had spent countless nights fueled by cheap coffee and sheer determination writing thousands of lines of code, while the rest of my family hosted lavish dinner parties downstairs, completely ignoring my existence. Just 30 minutes ago, my mother had stomped her designer heel straight through the laptop screen that birthed that very code. She had screamed that my work was uneducated trash. She had called me a parasite. My father had declared me a lowlife who lacked the ambition to survive in the real world. Trey had tossed a crumpled $50 bill at my feet, treating me like a destitute beggar, ruining his pristine driveway. I looked down at the notification again. $36 million. The sheer irony of the situation was intoxicating. My father had spent 4 decades kissing up to local politicians and backstabbing his business partners to build a real estate firm that was currently drowning in debt. He hosted extravagant galas, buying $1,000 bottles of champagne to impress men who secretly despised him. His total net worth, if you liquidated every single asset he owned and paid off his massive commercial loans, maybe hovered around $10 million. Trey walked around with a manufactured swagger, acting like a titan of industry because he managed a private equity fund. But Trey was essentially playing with other people's money. His actual liquid assets were tied up in luxury car leases, expensive watches, and a crippling mortgage on a house he could barely afford. Sydney, my perfect high-powered sister, spent her days drafting contracts for pennies compared to what I had just secured in a single digital transaction. I had bypassed both of their lifetimes of aggressive climbing and superficial posturing in a single afternoon. The very code my mother so confidently labeled as uneducated trash had just made me richer than my entire family's generational wealth combined. I possessed more liquid capital in this one account than William, Diane, Sydney, and Trey could summon if they liquidated their entire portfolios. I was no longer the quiet, overlooked daughter hiding in her room. I was a financial powerhouse, entirely self-made, operating entirely off their radar. I tapped the screen, transferring $5 million into a separate operational account to cover immediate expenses. Then I sent a brief encrypted message to my newly appointed wealth management team, authorizing them to begin establishing the corporate infrastructure for my holding company. I was not just going to sit on this cash, I was going to weaponize it. "Drive, Marcus," I said, my voice steady and commanding. "Take us into the city." "Understood, Ms. Blair," Marcus replied smoothly. The heavy SUV pulled away from the curb, leaving the affluent, toxic neighborhood in the rearview mirror. As we glided onto the highway, the city skyline looming in the distance, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the damp, crumpled $50 bill Trey had thrown at me. I smoothed out the wrinkles against my knee. It was a physical reminder of their absolute arrogance, of their fundamental inability to see value in anything they could not control. They believed they held all the power because they held the keys to the house. They did not realize I had just bought the entire game board. I opened my window just a fraction, letting a sliver of freezing air rush into the heated cabin. I held the $50 bill near the gap. The wind snatched it from my fingers, instantly sucking it out into the dark, snowy highway. I did not need Trey's charity. I did not need my father's roof. I did not need my mother's conditional, non-existent affection. My encrypted phone suddenly vibrated against the leather seat, signaling the beginning of my new empire. The encrypted screen of my phone illuminated the dim interior of the SUV, flashing with a high-priority incoming call. I swiped the green icon and brought the heavy device to my right ear. David, my wealth manager, possessed a voice perfectly modulated, completely devoid of any unnecessary emotion. He was a veteran of the elite financial sector, a man who truly understood that money was raw power. "Good evening, boss," David said, his tone crisp, clear, and efficient. "I am currently reviewing the daily operational logs for Apex Holdings. Something highly interesting just crossed my executive desk for final approval." I kept my gaze fixed on the snow-covered highway outside my window. Apex Holdings was the anonymous corporate entity we established specifically to manage my liquid assets and execute high-level investments away from public scrutiny. "Go ahead, David," I replied, my voice steady. "Tell me what we are looking at." Williams' real estate development firm and Trey's private equity fund have just submitted a joint application for a $10 million emergency bridging loan, David explained. The application came through our automated commercial lending portal 20 minutes ago. They are requesting an expedited wire transfer to cover immediate operational deficits. I let out a measured breath. A $10 million bridging loan was not a standard business maneuver. It was a distress flare. It meant their supposedly thriving empire was actively hemorrhaging cash. "Why are they coming to Apex Holdings?" I asked. My father and brother-in-law pride themselves on traditional banking relationships. They would not approach an unfamiliar private lending firm unless they had absolutely no other choice. David tapped a few keys on his end of the line. "I pulled their credit reports and preliminary financial disclosures," he continued. "Their traditional banking relationships have entirely dried up. William has overextended his credit lines across 3 different commercial build sites. Trey has been aggressively funneling capital from his private equity clients into William's failing projects to keep them afloat. They are severely overleveraged. If they do not secure a $10 million injection within 48 hours, they will default on multiple construction loans. The domino effect would trigger immediate audits and potential investigations into Trey's fund management. The sheer hypocrisy of it all was staggering. Just an hour ago, my father had screamed that I was uneducated trash. Trey had tossed a $50 bill at my feet, boasting about the VIP investors arriving at the house. Those investors were clearly a desperate mirage, a final pathetic attempt to secure funding before the entire house of cards collapsed. They were standing on the lawn, projecting absolute superiority while secretly drowning in massive, unmanageable debt. "And what exactly are they offering as collateral for this $10 million lifeline?" I asked, tracing the stitching on the leather seat. David cleared his throat. "That is the most interesting part, boss. They are pledging the primary residential estate in Connecticut as the sole collateral. The deed is fully unencumbered, but they are jointly signing over the property rights to Apex Holdings in the event of a default." A genuine smile finally broke across my face. It was not a smile of joy, but of cold, calculating realization. They were using the exact house they had just violently exiled me from to secure a loan from my own anonymous company. The poetic justice was almost too perfect to believe. They were literally handing me the deed to their fortress. I leaned forward, my mind rapidly shifting into strategic execution mode. "Approve the loan immediately," I instructed. "Give them the full $10 million they are begging for." Expedite the wire transfer so the funds hit their accounts by tomorrow morning. I want them to feel an overwhelming sense of relief. I want them to celebrate their clever business acumen tonight. There was a brief pause on the line. Are you absolutely certain? Boss David asked cautiously. Based on their current cash flow projections, the risk of default is exceptionally high. They are essentially borrowing money to pay off borrowed money. I am completely certain, David, I replied. But we are going to dictate the specific terms of their survival. I want you to draw up the contract right now. Set the interest rate at a predatory 25%. But more importantly, I want you to bury a specific clause deep within the fine print of the 50-page loan agreement. I want an immediate recall clause, I stated, enunciating every single syllable with lethal precision. Dictate that Apex Holdings reserves the absolute right to demand full immediate repayment of the $10 million principal plus all accrued interest if we discover any fraudulent financial representations in their application or collateral assets. If they cannot produce the cash within 24 hours of the recall notice, we seize the Connecticut estate instantly without engaging in a prolonged foreclosure battle. David understood the assignment completely and immediately recognized the sheer brilliance of the strategy. An immediate recall clause based on fraudulent representation, he confirmed. I will bury it in the risk disclosure section. They are so desperate for cash, their lawyers will skim right past it. Exactly, I said. Send the documents for digital signature immediately. Let them host their lavish dinner party tonight, thinking they have permanently secured their future. I ended the call and slipped the encrypted phone into my pocket. The armored SUV glided smoothly through the freezing winter night, carrying me toward the city. I watched the snow fall against the tinted glass, feeling profound calm. My parents and my brother-in-law spent years treating me like a parasite. They kicked me out into the freezing cold with nothing. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They had vastly underestimated my intelligence and the full extent of my hidden resources. The lethal contract was already being drafted. The bridging funds were queued for an immediate wire transfer. The trap was now officially and irrevocably set. For exactly 3 months, that trap remained perfectly hidden beneath the surface of their manufactured success. The $10 million wire transfer from Apex Holdings had hit Williams' corporate accounts the very next morning, instantly saving his stalled commercial projects from total collapse. Trey paraded around the financial district with renewed, unbearable arrogance, genuinely believing his brilliant negotiating skills had secured a lifeline from a mysterious private equity firm. They celebrated their survival entirely blind to the fact that my wealth management team had spent those same 90 days systematically verifying every single fraudulent claim on their loan application. They had inflated property valuations, hidden massive secondary debts, and forged revenue projections. The evidence was irrefutable. I held the power to destroy them with a single phone call, but I needed the timing to be absolutely flawless. Then came the text message from Diane on the Monday before Thanksgiving. Our family. Thanksgiving dinner was never about gratitude. It was a highly orchestrated theatrical production designed to parade Williams' perceived wealth in front of local politicians, zoning board members, and potential investors. I had fully intended to ignore the holiday entirely from the comfort of my luxury penthouse in the city. But Diane knew exactly what she held over me. When my parents violently kicked me out into the snow, I was forced to leave behind a small wooden cedar box hidden in the back of my closet. It contained the only things I actually cared about: a collection of handwritten journals from my childhood and a delicate gold locket that had belonged to my late grandmother. Diane's message was brief and dripping with venom. Show up to the house at 4 o'clock on Thursday. If you do not attend, your grandfather's old journals and that cheap locket go straight into the estate incinerator with the rest of your trash. I will not have your abandoned garbage cluttering my home. She thought she was exerting absolute control. She thought she was dragging a desperate, impoverished daughter back to grovel for scraps. She had no idea she had just handed me the perfect stage for their execution. On Thursday afternoon, I did not take my armored SUV or my private driver. I deliberately dressed in a plain faded gray sweater and worn jeans, renting a standard economy sedan for the drive to Connecticut. I parked 2 blocks away from the estate and walked the rest of the distance feeling the crisp autumn air against my face. The sprawling circular driveway was completely jammed with expensive sports cars and luxury vehicles. Valets in crisp black uniforms were rushing back and forth, holding umbrellas to shield the wealthy guests from the light evening drizzle. I bypassed the grand mahogany front doors and walked around to the service entrance at the back of the house. The moment I stepped into the massive industrial-grade kitchen, the chaotic noise of clattering pans and shouting chefs washed over me. Diane was standing near the center island, aggressively berating a terrified sous chef over the presentation of the caviar appetizers. She wore a custom emerald green silk dress, her hair perfectly styled, a heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. When she spotted me standing near the doorway, her eyes narrowed in immediate disgust. She abandoned the chef and marched directly toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. "You look absolutely dreadful," Diane sneered, looking me up and down as if I were something she had scraped off her shoe. "I see 3 months in the real world has not improved your situation at all." "Where is my grandmother's box, Diane?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely flat and devoid of emotion. "You will get your little trinkets when the night is over," she snapped, grabbing my arm and pulling me roughly toward a storage closet. "But since you are here, you are going to make yourself useful. 2 of the catering staff called in sick this morning, and the service is falling behind." She reached into a cardboard box on the shelf and pulled out a stiff white button-down shirt and a plain black waist apron. She shoved the garments forcefully into my chest. "The catering staff is short-handed," Diane stated, her voice lowering to a harsh, demanding whisper. "Since you have no real job and cannot afford a gift, you will serve the food. Put this on immediately and get out into the dining hall." I looked down at the uniform in my hands, then back up at her perfectly powdered face. I did not say a word. "And listen to me very carefully, Blair." Diane continued, stepping closer so I could smell the sharp tang of her expensive perfume. "Do not tell the guests you are my daughter. It is incredibly bad for William's image to have a dropout lingering around his investors. If anyone asks, you are hired help from the agency. You keep your head down, you keep your mouth shut, and you serve the champagne. Do you understand me?" She glared at me, waiting for the familiar flash of hurt or rebellion she had spent my entire life provoking. She wanted me to cry. She wanted me to throw the uniform on the floor and storm out, proving her narrative that I was unstable and useless. Instead, I simply held her gaze, my face a mask of absolute serenity. "I understand perfectly," I replied. I turned away from her, walked into the small employee bathroom, and stripped off my faded sweater. I pulled the crisp, white catering shirt over my shoulders, buttoned it to the collar, and tied the black apron tightly around my waist. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. I did not look like a billionaire tech founder. I looked exactly like the invisible compliant servant my mother desperately wanted me to be. I stepped back out into the chaotic kitchen. Diane gave me one final dismissive nod of approval before turning her attention back to the caterers. I walked over to the staging area, my movements precise and deliberate. I put on the uniform without a word, picking up a heavy silver tray loaded with crystal flutes of expensive vintage champagne, and stepped right into the lion's den. The grand dining hall was a masterclass in aggressive opulence. A live jazz quartet played a smooth, upbeat tempo from the corner of the room, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the clinking of crystal glassware and the low hum of wealthy conversations. The long dining table was draped in heavy silk and adorned with towering floral centerpieces, but the real action was happening near the massive stone fireplace. I navigated the crowded room with practiced invisibility. The caterer uniform was a perfect disguise. To these people, I was not a person. I was simply a mechanism for delivering alcohol. I moved silently through the clusters of local politicians and wealthy socialites, my silver tray perfectly balanced. As I approached the fireplace, I spotted Trey. He was holding court in the center of the room, surrounded by 3 older men, wearing bespoke suits and predatory expressions. These were the Wall Street investors my parents were desperately trying to impress the men holding the keys to the secondary funding my father needed to save his crumbling reputation. Trey held a glass of scotch, gesturing expansively with his free hand. He was practically vibrating with arrogance. The market is shifting, gentlemen, but we are positioned perfectly ahead of the curve. Trey boasted, his voice loud enough to ensure the surrounding guests could hear his triumph. In fact, we just secured massive backing from Apex Holdings, a $10 million injection of capital approved in absolute record time. One of the older investors, a silver-haired man with a sharp, calculating gaze, raised an eyebrow. Apex Holdings. They are notoriously selective, Trey. I am surprised a boutique fund like yours caught their attention. Trey chuckled, taking a slow sip of his drink. It is all about relationships and leveraging undeniable asset strength. They recognized our unique market position immediately. The board practically begged us to take their terms. With Apex backing our primary operations, this new commercial plaza project is a guaranteed windfall for anyone getting in on the ground floor tonight. I stood mere feet away holding my tray of champagne, listening to my brother-in-law build his entire house of cards on the foundation of my anonymous company. He was publicly tying his professional reputation and his investors' money to a loan that I could detonate with a single phone call. He was so blinded by his own ego that he never once considered who might actually be sitting on the other side of that digital transaction. Before the silver-haired investor could ask another probing question, Sydney swept into the circle. My sister always knew exactly how to command a room. She wore a sleek floor-length crimson gown, but it was the jewelry that instantly drew every eye in the vicinity. Resting against her collarbone was a blinding, intricate diamond necklace. It was not a subtle piece, it was a massive, aggressive display of raw wealth. "Sydney, darling, you look absolutely stunning," one of the investors remarked, his eyes lingering heavily on the diamonds. "That is quite a piece you are wearing." Sydney smiled, touching the stones with manicured fingers. She leaned into Trey, painting the picture of a flawless, unstoppable power couple. "A little reward to myself for a record-breaking quarter." Sydney purred, her voice dripping with manufactured modesty. "Our real estate profits have never been stronger. The firm is expanding faster than we can manage." I thought it was time to celebrate our success. My mind calculated the reality behind her words with cold, mechanical precision. That necklace was easily a $100,000 piece. My parents and Trey had secured an emergency bridging loan specifically meant to cover operational deficits and construction defaults. Instead of deploying those funds to save their failing projects, Sydney had immediately diverted a massive chunk of the corporate loan to purchase personal luxury jewelry to parade in front of potential investors. It was the textbook definition of corporate fraud. It was a direct, undeniable violation of the financial representations they had signed with Apex Holdings. They had handed me the exact weapon I needed to execute the recall clause. I stepped forward to offer the men fresh champagne. As I moved into the light, Sydney turned her head. Her eyes locked onto my face. The shock registered for only a fraction of a second. She took in the crisp white button-down shirt, the black waist apron, the heavy serving tray in my hands. The surprise instantly vanished, replaced by a dark, malicious delight. She looked at Trey, who gave her a subtle, knowing smirk. They honestly believed they had finally put me in my rightful place. Sydney held a full glass of dark Cabernet Sauvignon in her right hand. She took a step forward, smoothly separating herself from the group of investors. I stood perfectly still, offering the silver tray. I watched her eyes track the distance. I saw her shift her weight. It was not an accident. It was a highly calculated strike. Sydney lunged forward, intentionally driving her shoulder hard into my chest while simultaneously jerking her wrist upward. The heavy wineglass tipped forward. The dark red liquid splashed violently across my uniform, soaking instantly into the crisp white fabric of the catering shirt and running in long, sticky streaks down my black apron. Several guests nearby gasped. The silver-haired investor stepped back to avoid the splash zone. "Oh my goodness, I am so incredibly sorry," Sydney announced, her voice pitched loud enough to draw the attention of the entire room. She placed a hand over her mouth in a perfect pantomime of shock. I simply did not see you standing there. You really should be more careful when moving around the guests. The room fell into an uncomfortable hush. My mother watched from across the hall, a satisfied smile playing on her lips. I stood there dripping with cheap wine, my face completely impassive. Sydney stepped closer, invading my personal space under the guise of inspecting the damage. She leaned her head down, placing her lips mere inches from my ear so no one else could hear the venom in her voice. "Just like college, right?" Sydney whispered maliciously, her breath hot against my skin. "You always were so clumsy. Remember when your prestigious university scholarship application miraculously got lost in the mail? I shredded it, Blair. I put it straight through Dad's office shredder so you could not leave the state and outshine me. You were always destined to be the help. Do yourself a favor and go clean up in the kitchen before you embarrass yourself further." The puzzle pieces of my past violently slammed into place. My sudden lack of funding, the rejections I could never understand, the years I spent drowning in depression, believing I was not good enough, believing I had failed on my own merits. It was not a failure. It was a systematic, deliberate sabotage executed by my own sister to keep me beneath her. The anger did not boil. It froze into absolute, unbreakable ice. I did not scramble for a napkin. I did not apologize to the guests. I did not bow my head and retreat to the kitchen as they all expected. I looked Sydney dead in the eyes, reading the pathetic insecurity hiding behind her stolen diamonds. I turned slightly, ignoring the wine dripping from my uniform. I reached out and placed the heavy silver tray directly onto the center of the pristine antique marble table beside us. I did not set it down gently. I let it drop. The sharp, heavy clink of crystal glass and solid silver cut violently through the soft jazz music. The music stopped, the conversations died. Every single eye in the grand hall locked onto me. The sharp, heavy clink of crystal glass and solid silver cut violently through the soft jazz music. The lively conversations buzzing throughout the grand dining hall ceased instantly. The silence was absolute and suffocating. Sydney stood frozen, her triumphant smirk faltering as she expected me to drop to my knees and desperately scrub the expensive marble floor. I did not move a single inch toward the mess. I stood perfectly straight, ignoring the dark red wine soaking through my thin white shirt and sticking to my skin. I turned my gaze away from my sister's bewildered face. I looked past the ruined serving tray and focused entirely on the center of the room. I looked directly at Trey, who was still holding his glass of scotch, surrounded by the key investors who held the fate of his failing firm in their hands. "Brother-in-law, did you tell your partners that the Apex loan carries a predatory 25% interest rate?" I asked, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity across the silent room. Trey flinched, a splash of scotch sloshing over the rim of his glass. His eyes widened in absolute shock. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, my soaked shoes squeaking slightly on the marble. "Or did you tell them that you used phantom collateral properties you do not even own yet to secure it?" The SEC has been handing out federal indictments for wire fraud for exactly that kind of structuring lately. The silver-haired investor, the man Trey had been desperately trying to court all evening, lowered his drink. His sharp, calculating eyes darted from Trey to me, his brow furrowing in deep suspicion. "What exactly is she talking about?" "Trey," the investor demanded, his tone losing all its previous warmth. "Who is this caterer, and how does she know the terms of a confidential private equity loan?" Trey opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. Diane broke through the crowd, her face twisted in a mask of panic and fury. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin. "Security!" Diane shrieked, her voice shrill and desperate. "Get this deranged girl out of here right now! She is a disgruntled former employee trying to ruin our evening." I effortlessly wrenched my arm out of her grip. "I am not a disgruntled employee." "Diane," I stated loudly, ensuring every wealthy guest in the room heard every single word. "I am your daughter, the one you actively hide like a dirty secret because I refuse to participate in your superficial charades." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered crowd. The investors exchanged highly alarmed glances. William pushed his way to the front, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. "Shut your mouth and get out of my house!" William roared, stepping into my personal space in a blatant attempt at physical intimidation. "You are nothing but an ugly, uneducated dropout. You know absolutely nothing about high-level finance. You are making up insane lies because you are jealous of your sister and her husband. Gentlemen, please ignore her. She has a history of severe mental instability." I did not back down. I held my ground against my father's imposing frame. "I am not making anything up, William," I countered smoothly. "I know exactly how you operate, just like how you quietly leveraged the employee pension fund at your last firm to cover your bad bets on the Southside development 5 years ago. You thought sealing those court records hid the truth, but it is exactly why no legitimate federally insured bank will touch your credit today. It is exactly why you had to beg an anonymous shell company for a predatory bridging loan." William took a stumbling step backward, the color draining completely from his face. His mouth hung open. The fact that I knew about his sealed financial history completely paralyzed him. Trey finally found his voice, stepping forward with a manufactured, nervous laugh. "Arthur, please, you cannot possibly believe the ramblings of an estranged, jealous sister. She is throwing out buzzwords. The Apex Holdings loan is a standard low-interest mezzanine facility secured by fully realized assets. We have the digital paperwork to prove it." I turned my attention back to Trey, stripping off the wine-soaked black apron and letting it drop onto the floor. "Is that right, Trey?" I challenged. "Then perhaps you can explain Section 4, Paragraph 12 of your highly confidential Apex contract. The clause that strictly prohibits the diversion of capital for personal luxury assets." I pointed a steady finger directly at Sydney's chest. The massive diamond necklace sparkled under the grand chandeliers, suddenly looking less like a triumph and more like a glowing beacon of guilt. "Because the wire transfer from Apex Holdings hit your corporate account at exactly 8 o'clock this morning," I continued, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "And according to standard accounting trails, a wire transfer for exactly $100,000 left that same corporate account at 9:15, going straight to Winston Jewelers. You are parading around the room showing off your corporate profits, but you are literally wearing the diverted funds of an emergency loan." Sydney gasped, her hand flying up to cover the diamonds as if my words could physically burn them. "You are lying," she stammered, looking frantically around the room at the staring guests. "She is a liar. Trey bought this for me with his own money." The silver-haired investor Arthur did not look at Sydney. He stepped directly in front of Trey, his expression hardening into pure, unadulterated fury. "The SEC does not care about family drama," Arthur stated, his voice dangerously low. "But they care very much about phantom collateral and diverted corporate funds. I want to see the unredacted digital contract from Apex Holdings right now, Trey. Open your phone and show me the exact terms of the collateral." Trey swallowed hard. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "Arthur, I cannot just pull up confidential documents in the middle of a dinner party. It violates our non-disclosure agreement with Apex. If you do not show me that contract in the next 10 seconds, I am pulling my entire syndicate out of your commercial plaza project," Arthur threatened, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "And I will personally place a call to the regulatory board in the morning." The silence returned heavier and more suffocating than before. The investors looked at Trey in shock, waiting for him to produce the proof that would save his entire career. He reached into his tailored pocket, his hand trembling so violently he could barely grip his smartphone. He pulled it out, staring blindly at the dark screen. He knew what the contract said. He knew the predatory interest rate was there. He knew the collateral properties were heavily encumbered. He looked up at the circle of powerful men surrounding him, then looked over at me, standing calmly amidst the wreckage of their perfect evening. The manufactured swagger completely evaporated from his posture. The arrogant light died in his eyes. Trey's face lost every ounce of color, going completely dreadfully ashen. The silence stretched to its absolute breaking point, heavy and suffocating. Arthur did not wait for Trey to formulate another lie or produce a redacted document. He turned to his associates, gave a sharp, definitive nod, and the three Wall Street titans simply walked away. They did not shout. They did not argue. They treated Trey exactly like a toxic asset to be immediately discarded. William lunged after them, his face frantic, begging Arthur for 5 minutes in his private study to clarify the misunderstanding. Arthur brushed past my father as if he were entirely invisible, signaling the immediate and permanent end of their financial relationship. The remaining party guests began murmuring nervously, setting down their champagne flutes and inching toward the exits. The lavish Thanksgiving dinner had instantly transformed into a crime scene. Sydney let out a high, panicked noise, clutching her diamond necklace as she watched the foundational pillars of their wealth march out the front door. Trey remained rooted to the floor. His smartphone slipped from his slick, sweating fingers, shattering against the marble tile. For 3 agonizing seconds, he stared at the broken glass. Then a dark, primal rage overtook the shock. The carefully constructed mask of the refined private equity fund manager completely disintegrated, revealing the volatile, violent man hiding beneath the expensive suit. He lunged. Before anyone could process the sudden movement, Trey's large hand clamped down onto my upper arm. His fingers dug viciously into my bicep, bruising the skin through the thin, wine-soaked fabric of my catering shirt. He did not care about the remaining guests. He did not care about the murmurs of horror rippling through the room as he manhandled the hired help. He hauled me forward with brutal, terrifying momentum, dragging me forcefully away from the grand dining hall and shoving me through the heavy oak doors leading into the isolated west hallway. The heavy doors swung shut behind us, muting the jazz music and the shocked gasps of the party. The hallway was dimly lit, lined with austere portraits of ancestors who had built the very fortune my father and brother-in-law were currently squandering. Trey shoved me hard against the wood-paneled wall. The impact rattled my teeth, but I refused to break eye contact. I refused to let him see even a single fraction of fear. "You stupid, ungrateful little wretch!" Trey hissed, spit flying from his lips as he crowded my personal space. "You have absolutely no idea what you just did. I am going to lose everything because you could not keep your mouth shut. You think you are so clever throwing around terms you read on the internet. You think you can waltz in here wearing a servant uniform and destroy my life with a lucky guess." He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as his anger escalated into a dangerous, uncontrolled fury. "You are nothing." He spat his face inches from mine. "You are a college dropout. You are trash. You belong serving drinks to people like me. I will make sure you never work in this state again. I will bury you." He stepped back, shifting his weight, his face contorted with unadulterated hatred. He raised his right hand high above his shoulder, fully intending to strike me across the face for speaking out of turn. He wanted to physically punish me. He wanted to assert the physical dominance he felt he was owed to regain some semblance of control over his rapidly collapsing world. I did not flinch. I did not cower. I stood perfectly straight against the wall, my chin raised, watching his hand reach the apex of its arc. I looked at him with absolute chilling pity. Right before his hand fell, a harsh, rapid buzzing sound cut through the tense air between us. Trey's smartwatch vibrated frantically against his wrist. It was not a standard text message notification. It was the continuous blaring alarm of a top-tier financial emergency. His hand froze mid-air. Human instinct forced his eyes to dart down to the glowing digital screen strapped to his wrist. I watched the blood flow completely out of his face for the second time that evening. The bright red text illuminated the dim hallway, reflecting in his widened, terrified eyes. Automated alert: executive accounts frozen. Immediate internal audit triggered. Apex Holdings. Principal recall initiated. Status: total liquidation. The notification was the death sentence. It meant David and my wealth management team had pulled the trigger the exact second I gave the signal. Every single corporate account tied to his name, his private equity fund, and his fraudulent collateral was firmly and irrevocably locked. He was entirely cut off from his own money. The firm was dead. The massive $10 million debt was due immediately. He was officially and legally destitute, with federal indictments looming on the horizon. Trey lowered his hands slowly. His jaw trembled. He looked up from his watch and stared at me. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. His arrogant brain finally connected the dots. He finally understood that I was not repeating internet buzzwords. I knew the specific contract terms because I dictated them. I was the architect of his demise. I was Apex Holdings. The absolute horror radiating from his eyes was the most satisfying thing I had ever witnessed. The bully was finally broken. I calmly reached up and adjusted my wine-stained collar, smoothing the fabric with slow, deliberate precision. I stepped away from the wall entirely unbothered by his presence, completely immune to his existence. "Happy Thanksgiving, Trey," I whispered, my voice cold, lethal, and final. I turned my back on him. I did not run. I walked down the long corridor with the measured, steady pace of a woman who had just conquered an empire. I pushed open the heavy front doors and stepped out into the crisp, freezing autumn night. The valet stared at me in confusion as I bypassed the luxury cars and walked down the long driveway toward my rental. I left them all trapped in the burning wreckage of their own making. The trap had snapped shut and I was finally free. Exactly 7 days passed. 7 days of frantic, unanswered voicemails filling my phone. The financial bloodbath was spectacular to watch from afar. Trey's private equity firm was plastered across the daily business journals, rapidly hemorrhaging clients as the SEC officially opened a formal inquiry into his use of phantom collateral. Williams' commercial developments were abruptly padlocked, construction halted completely as subcontractors walked off the job due to bounced checks. The absolute silence I maintained was my sharpest weapon. I let them sweat. I let them realize the full magnitude of their ruin. Then came the invitation. It arrived not as a demand, but as a sickeningly sweet text message from Diane. She asked me to join them for a private family lunch at the Oak Ridge Country Club. Oak Ridge was their ultimate sanctuary. It was the epicenter of their manufactured social dominance. Growing up, I was explicitly banned from attending their Sunday brunches there. William always claimed my quiet demeanor made the family look weak in front of his golf partners. Being invited now to the main dining room was their highest form of a concession. They genuinely believed that granting me access to their elite world would immediately buy my compliance. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer and walked into the dining room exactly 10 minutes late. The maitre d' led me to a secluded alcove table overlooking the 18th hole. William, Diane, and Trey were already seated. Sydney was noticeably absent, likely unable to stomach the humiliation or perhaps legally advised to keep her distance after the jewelry incident. The moment I approached the table, the performance began. William stood up, offering a tight, forced smile that did not reach his bloodshot eyes. He pulled out my chair. It was the first time in my entire life that my father had ever pulled out a chair for me. Diane immediately reached across the crisp white tablecloth, attempting to grab my hand. I smoothly pulled my hand back, reaching for my water glass instead. Her smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, shifting into her rehearsed routine. "Blair, darling." Diane started, her voice trembling with heavily manufactured emotion. "We are so incredibly glad you came. This past week has been an absolute nightmare for all of us. We have done a lot of soul-searching. We realized that things got entirely out of hand at the house. We were just so surprised, so caught off guard by your outburst." I picked up the leather-bound menu, completely ignoring her theatrics. "Are we ordering, or are we just going to sit here and pretend you did not exile me into the freezing snow 3 months ago?" I asked, keeping my gaze fixed on the entrees. Trey shifted uncomfortably, tugging at the collar of a suit that suddenly looked slightly too big for him. The stress was eating him alive. He looked like a man who had not slept in a week, his face pale, his jaw tense. "Let us not dwell on the past," Blair William interjected, using his deep, authoritative boardroom voice. "We are family, and family sometimes has misunderstandings. What matters is that we are sitting here today, ready to move forward. We already ordered you the filet. Medium rare, just how you like it." I never ate my steak medium rare. Sydney did, but I did not correct him. The waiter arrived, placing our meals onto the table with practiced efficiency. I picked up my knife and fork, cutting into the meat with deliberate precision. William leaned forward, folding his hands together on the table. "The truth is, we are facing a temporary liquidity issue, a minor cash flow bottleneck." The Apex Holdings situation was a gross misunderstanding, a clerical error on Trey's part that triggered an automated account freeze. We are actively clearing it up with the federal regulators, but in the meantime, our primary operating accounts are tied up in red tape. Diane produced a single, perfectly timed tear, dabbing the corner of her eye with a monogrammed linen napkin. It is destroying your father, Blair. He has worked his entire life to build this empire. If we do not secure a bridge loan by Friday, the banks are going to initiate foreclosure on the commercial sites. We could lose the Connecticut estate entirely. I chewed my steak slowly, savoring the tender cut. I swallowed, taking a slow sip of sparkling water. And what exactly does this temporary liquidity issue have to do with me? Trey cleared his throat, finally speaking up. The traditional lenders are being overly cautious right now because of the SEC inquiry. They want a clean guarantor, someone entirely disconnected from the corporate entities. We know you do not have the liquid capital to bail us out, but you have zero existing debt. You have a completely clean financial slate. We just need you to co-sign a minor business loan. A minor business loan? I repeated, my voice devoid of any inflection. Exactly. William urged, his eyes gleaming with desperate, pathetic hope. It is a mere formality, Blair. $7 million to cover the operating costs for 30 days. The collateral is fully secured. You will not have to pay a single dime. We just need your clean signature to bypass the automated risk algorithms at the bank. It is the only way to save the family. They were asking the billionaire owner of the company that had just bankrupted them to co-sign a $7 million loan because they thought I was a broke, debt-free nobody. The sheer, unadulterated audacity was breathtaking. They were trying to tie my name to their sinking ship, legally binding me to their imminent default, so that when they inevitably went down, I would be dragged down into bankruptcy with them. They would sacrifice my financial future without a second thought just to buy themselves 30 days of breathing room. I cut another piece of steak. I brought it to my mouth, chewed methodically, and swallowed. I placed my silverware neatly on the edge of the porcelain plate. I dabbed my lips with the linen napkin. No. The single syllable dropped onto the table like a lead weight. William blinked, his forced smile freezing in place. I am sorry, maybe I did not explain it properly. You will carry zero actual risk. I understand perfectly, William, I replied, locking my eyes directly onto his. You want me to legally tether myself to $7 million of fraudulent debt because your actual assets are frozen by federal regulators? The answer is absolutely not. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The desperate hope in their eyes evaporated instantly. The polite familial facade they had carefully maintained for the past 20 minutes completely shattered. William's posture rigidified. The pleading, desperate father vanished, replaced instantly by the ruthless, calculating predator who had spent 3 decades crushing his competitors. The polite, familial facade they had carefully maintained for the past 20 minutes completely shattered. He reached down to the expensive leather briefcase, resting against the leg of his chair. The rhythmic, sharp clicking of designer heels echoed across the polished hardwood floor, approaching our alcove from the direction of the country club lobby. A heavy cloud of floral perfume announced her arrival before she even spoke. Sydney had not skipped the lunch out of humiliation. She had been waiting in the lobby, keeping out of sight, acting as the dramatic closer for their orchestrated ambush. She slid smoothly into the empty chair beside Trey, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute venomous delight. William pulled a thick manila legal folder from his briefcase. He raised it high and brought it down hard, slamming the thick legal folder onto the table. The sudden impact rattled the fine crystal water glasses and caused a few nearby diners to glance over in our direction. William did not care. Refusing isn't an option. William stated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous gravel. He flipped the folder open. Inside were stacks of bank applications, credit approvals, and digital printouts. I recognized the letterhead immediately. It was from a mid-tier regional bank, one known for aggressively approving commercial lines of credit with minimal oversight. Sydney and I already used your social security number to secure a $2 million line of credit to keep us afloat. William continued, tracing a thick finger over a forged signature at the bottom of the top page. I stared down at the blue ink. They had not just stolen my identity. They had meticulously fabricated my financial profile, leveraging my pristine credit history to bypass the institutional blocks triggered by the SEC investigation. They had dug up my personal identification numbers from old tax returns stored at the family estate and weaponized them. It was textbook, irrefutable identity theft. It was a federal crime carrying severe mandatory minimum sentences. We pushed the paperwork through digital channels to avoid in-person verification. Trey added, his voice shaking slightly, betraying his deep anxiety over the felonies they had just committed. But the bank requires a wet signature on this final document to fully release the capital into our operating accounts. William leaned aggressively over the table, invading my physical space. His eyes were cold and dead. If you don't sign this retroactive consent form right now, I will call the police and report that you stole your mother's heirloom diamonds before you moved out. He pointed a rigid finger at my chest. We have the insurance appraisals. We have the purchase receipts. I will tell the authorities that you slipped into the house during the Thanksgiving party, bypassed the security system using your old access codes, and emptied the master bedroom safe. Who do you think the police will believe, Blair, a respected corporate CEO and his grieving wife, or an estranged, bitter daughter with a chip on her shoulder? Diane took a slow, elegant sip of her Chardonnay. She did not flinch. She did not object to her husband framing her youngest daughter for grand larceny. She simply watched me with empty reptilian eyes, entirely complicit in my destruction. It's prison, or you play your part as the family scapegoat. William finished tapping a gold-plated pen against the signature line of the consent form. You sign this, you take the financial hit when the loan eventually defaults and we let you walk away. You refuse and I will have you arrested before you reach the parking lot. The sheer scale of their depravity was staggering. They were not just asking me to save them, they had preemptively sold me to the slaughterhouse. They had deliberately tied an anchor to my neck to stop themselves from drowning. The irony of the situation was nearly suffocating. They were blackmailing a billionaire over a $2 million fraudulent loan because they genuinely still believed I was a destitute caterer. Sydney leans in, smiling cruelly. You're uneducated trash. Doing a few years in a federal facility won't hurt a resume you don't even have. She crossed her arms, looking down her nose at me. You were always destined to be the loser of this family, Blair. We are simply putting you to your best use. Consider it your rent for all the years Mom and Dad kept a roof over your head. I looked at the gold-plated pen resting on the table. I looked at the meticulously forged documents. I looked at the four people sitting across from me, so thoroughly blinded by their own arrogance that they could not see the trap closing around their throats. They thought they held all the cards. They thought a fabricated theft charge and a fraudulent commercial loan was the ultimate leverage. They had absolutely no concept of the fire they were currently playing with. I calmly picked up my steak knife. I sliced off a small, perfectly square piece of the filet mignon. I placed it in my mouth, chewed methodically, and swallowed, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water to wash it down. I wiped my mouth with the linen napkin, folding it neatly beside my plate. I looked directly into William's eyes and flatly refused. The facade immediately drops. William's face darkened, the thick veins in his neck bulging against his stiff white collar. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He leaned aggressively across the table, his massive frame blocking out the ambient light from the dining room windows, trapping me in his shadow. You do not have a choice, Blair Williams stated, his voice a low, guttural rasp that completely lacked the polished charm he reserved for his investors. This is not a negotiation. This is an ultimatum. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it over the forged bank documents. It was a formal police incident report already filled out with the Oak Ridge Police Department letterhead. Read it, William commanded. I glanced down at the paper. It detailed the theft of my mother's heirloom diamond collection valued at just over $1 million. It named me as the sole suspect, citing my recent estrangement and supposed financial desperation as the primary motive. Chief Henderson plays golf with me every Tuesday. William continued tapping the top of the report with his index finger. He owes me several substantial favors. Diane has already signed the sworn affidavit claiming she saw you in the master suite on Thanksgiving night. If you walk away from this table without signing the bank consent form, I will make one phone call. Chief Henderson will have officers waiting at your apartment before you even pull into the driveway. You will be arrested for grand larceny. With your lack of resources, you will sit in a holding cell for months awaiting trial. You will be a convicted felon. Diane took a delicate sip of her wine. It is truly for your own good, darling. We are just trying to keep the family intact. You owe us this much after the humiliation you caused Trey. And the bank fraud, I asked, my voice perfectly feigning the terrified, cornered prey they believed me to be. The federal authorities will find out about the $2 million line of credit. I will go to prison for that anyway. Trey let out a sharp, arrogant laugh. He leaned back in his chair, suddenly overflowing with the manufactured confidence of a man who believed he had just successfully outsmarted the federal government. The SEC is completely blinded by the Apex Holdings freeze, Trey bragged, eager to demonstrate his supposed financial genius. They are tearing apart my private equity accounts, but they are not looking at regional commercial banks. We routed the application through a shell company registered under your name in Delaware. I used my contacts at the regional branch to push the approval through their automated risk assessment. The algorithm saw a 30-year-old woman with zero outstanding debt and a pristine credit score. It was the easiest $2 million I have ever secured. Sydney leaned in a cruel, triumphant smile, twisting her perfectly glossed lips. She wanted her share of the credit. She wanted to twist the knife. And you do not even have to worry about the digital signatures, Sydney boasted, her voice dripping with immense condescension. I handled that part myself. I found an old birthday card you signed for Mom 5 years ago. I scanned it, digitized the pen strokes, and applied it to the initial loan applications. It was a perfect match. The bank verification software accepted it without a single red flag. You were entirely useless to this family, Blair, but your unblemished social security number turned out to be your one redeeming quality. They were laying it all out, every single detail, every felony, every point of leverage, extortion, identity theft, and wire fraud articulated clearly and proudly in the middle of a crowded country club dining room. They were so utterly convinced of their invincibility, so thoroughly intoxicated by their perceived dominance over me, that they felt absolutely no need to filter their confessions. We just need the wet signature on the retroactive consent form, William reiterated, pointing to the thick gold pen resting beside my plate. The regional manager needs physical paperwork to satisfy the compliance department before he wires the funds into Trey's shadow account. Sign the paper, Blair. You take the liability on paper, we get the cash to save our actual assets, and the police report regarding your mother's diamonds goes directly into the shredder. It is a simple transaction. I looked down at the stack of fraudulent documents. I let my shoulders slump forward. I allowed my breathing to turn shallow and ragged, perfectly mimicking the physical response of a woman completely broken by her family's ruthless extortion. I stared at the signature line, letting the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds. I did not scream. I did not throw my water glass in William's face. I did not cause a scene. I slowly reached across the table. My fingers hovered over the heavy gold-plated pen. I picked it up. The metal was cold against my skin. I pulled the retroactive consent form toward me, uncapped the pen, and pressed the nib against the thick parchment. With smooth, practiced strokes, I signed my name perfectly on the dotted line. William instantly snatched the paper out from under my hand. The moment his fingers closed around the document, the oppressive tension at the table evaporated into a sickening wave of arrogant relief. William let out a deep, booming laugh, slapping the folder shut and sliding it securely back into his leather briefcase. Good girl, he sneered, the mock affection sounding worse than a threat. I knew you would eventually see reason. You always were weak when push came to shove. Sydney rolled her eyes, scoffing, as she picked up her champagne flute. You are such a pathetic pushover, Blair. You tried to play the big tough mastermind at Thanksgiving, and look at you now. Folding like a cheap lawn chair, the second dad applied a little pressure. You are uneducated trash. Doing a few years in a federal facility when this loan defaults won't hurt a resume you don't even have. Diane smiled, her cold reptilian smile adjusting her pearl necklace. You did the right thing for the family, dear. You can leave now. We have business to discuss. I stood up from the table, smoothing the front of my tailored charcoal blazer. I looked at the four of them basking in their hollow, fraudulent victory. They truly believed they had won. They truly believed they had successfully extorted the family scapegoat to save their crumbling empire. I reached up with my right hand and gently adjusted the small, elegant diamond brooch pinned to my left lapel. They were completely blissfully unaware that the vintage piece of jewelry was actually a state-of-the-art, high-definition recording device. Every single word of their boastful confessions, the identity theft, the wire fraud, the forged digital signatures, the extortion regarding the fake police report, and the conspiracy to deceive federal banking regulators had been captured in crystal-clear audio and 4K video. I had not just signed a bank document, I had just collected the final irrefutable pieces of evidence required to send every single one of them to a federal penitentiary. I walked away from the alcove without a single backward glance. The rhythmic clinking of fine silver against porcelain and the hushed, polite murmurs of Oak Ridge Country Club's elite patrons faded into background noise. The air inside the grand dining room was thick with the scent of roasted meats, expensive perfumes, and misplaced arrogance. I navigated through the labyrinth of mahogany tables with a steady, measured pace. I did not hurry. I moved with the precise, unhurried cadence of a predator that had just secured its kill. Pushing through the heavy brass-trimmed doors, I stepped out onto the grand portico. The crisp, freezing afternoon air bit at my cheeks, instantly clearing the suffocating stench of my family's desperation from my lungs. The valet rushed forward, ready to ask for my ticket, but stopped short. A massive obsidian black Mercedes Maybach glided smoothly to the base of the stone steps, bypassing the queue of luxury SUVs. My personal security director, Marcus, stepped out instantly, pulling open the heavy rear door. I slid into the expansive, temperature-controlled leather interior. The heavy door clicked shut instantly, sealing me inside a soundproof vault, completely isolating me from the world outside. I reached up and unpinned the vintage diamond brooch from my charcoal lapel. I turned it over, pressing a microscopic indentation on the gold backing. A tiny concealed port slid open. I retrieved a customized data cable from the center console, connected the device to my encrypted tablet, and watched the digital progress bar flash across the high-resolution screen. Uploading, verifying, encrypting. The audio file was flawless. The ambient noise of the country club had been effortlessly filtered out by the military-grade microphone, leaving only the crystal-clear damning voices of my father, my mother, my sister, and my brother-in-law. Every boast about digital forgery, every detailed explanation of bank fraud, every specific threat of extortion involving the fabricated police report was perfectly preserved. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to my lead litigation counsel in Manhattan. He answered on the first ring. The trap snapped shut, I stated, my voice echoing in the quiet cabin of the Maybach. I tapped the screen, authorizing the secure transfer of the digital package. Send the unedited audio, the forged documents, and the wire fraud traces directly to the FBI. And the IRSI commanded, leaning back into the plush leather seating. I want simultaneous delivery to the white-collar crime division and the federal banking regulators. I watched the city blur past the tinted windows as Marcus steered the massive vehicle onto the highway. The entire foundation of the Wilson Empire was about to be pulverized. By signing that retroactive consent form, I had provided the federal authorities with the final definitive link between their fraudulent shell companies and the illegal line of credit. Sydney had proudly confessed to fabricating digital signatures. William had explicitly detailed his intent to commit extortion and file a false police report. Trey had brazenly outlined his conspiracy to bypass automated banking algorithms to illegally siphon $2 million. They had meticulously handed me the exact coordinates for a precision airstrike on their lives. Ensure the SEC task force currently investigating Trey's private equity firm receives a copy of the audio as well, I instructed. They need to understand that the phantom collateral issue is not an isolated incident. It is part of a coordinated, systemic pattern of federal fraud encompassing multiple corporate entities and regional banks. I want all of his domestic and offshore accounts locked down before the stock exchange opens on Monday morning. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the absolute weight of 30 years of familial gaslighting and financial manipulation finally detaching from my shoulders. The emotional abuse, the constant belittling, the coordinated attempts to make me feel small and insignificant were officially over. They had built their entire identity on the illusion of immense wealth and untouchable power. I was about to strip away the illusion and leave them with nothing but the brutal, unvarnished reality of their own criminal incompetence, and notify Apex Holdings to execute the immediate recall clause on Williams' properties. I added my tone, turning clinical and exact. The $10 million bridging loan was in technical default the exact second they utilized my stolen identity to secure secondary financing without notifying the primary lien holder. William had leveraged everything. The commercial plazas, the downtown high-rises, and the sprawling Connecticut estate were all legally bound to the Apex contract. The moment the recall clause was triggered, ownership of every single brick beam and manicured lawn defaulted directly to my holding company. They thought they had bought themselves 30 days of breathing room. In reality, they had accelerated their execution by an entire month. The banks would instantly freeze their remaining credit lines the moment the federal subpoenas were issued. The subcontractors working on Williams' commercial sites would file immediate mechanics liens. The Oak Ridge Country Club, the very place they had just tried to extort me, would quietly and swiftly revoke their membership the second the indictments became public record. My attorney confirmed the instructions detailing the rapid deployment of the legal filings and the coordination with federal law enforcement contacts. The machinery of my corporate empire was shifting into high gear and unstoppable force, preparing to eradicate the fragile house of cards my father had spent 3 decades building. I looked down at the encrypted tablet, watching the final confirmation receipt flash across the screen. The transfer to the federal authorities was complete. The evidence was in their hands. There was no walking it back. There were no negotiations, no plea deals, and no more family dinners. Have the foreclosure served tonight, I ordered. Hand-delivered. The Four Seasons Grand Ballroom was a glittering, opulent monument to manufactured prestige. Towering crystal chandeliers refracted warm light onto massive ice sculptures carved into the shapes of luxury high-rises. Waiters in crisp, tailored tuxedos circulated smoothly through the crowd, balancing silver trays loaded with Dom Perignon and Beluga caviar. William and Trey were hosting the Apex Zenith launch gala, billed to the public and the press as the highly exclusive unveiling of their most ambitious commercial real estate project to date. In reality, the entire evening was a desperate high-stakes grift. With their existing corporate assets quietly frozen by federal regulators and their operational accounts completely choked by SEC red tape, tonight was their final, frantic maneuver. They needed to scam millions in fresh, unregulated capital from the city's wealthy elite just to cover their immediate failing debts. It was a classic Ponzi scheme dressed up in black tie attire. They needed blind checks signed by midnight, and they were pulling out every conceivable stop to project an illusion of absolute financial invulnerability. Across the packed ballroom, the family held court, entirely convinced of their own invincibility. William was in his absolute element. His booming laughter echoed over the classical string quartet as he aggressively slapped the back of a prominent regional hedge fund manager. He was ruthlessly selling the illusion, boasting loudly about imaginary permits, phantom zoning approvals, and guaranteed triple-digit returns. To the untrained eye, he was the titan of industry he always claimed to be. To me, watching the financial tracking data flow into my tablet from the back of my Maybach, he was a dead man walking. Diane fluttered seamlessly between groups of wealthy socialites dripping in the very same heirloom diamonds William had threatened to accuse me of stealing just hours earlier. She radiated the toxic, suffocating smugness of a woman who believed she had successfully sacrificed her youngest daughter to secure her country club status. She accepted compliments on her jewelry with a gracious, practiced tilt of her head, completely devoid of any guilt over the multiple felonies her family had committed that afternoon. She was already bragging to the mayor's wife about our touching family lunch and how I had finally stepped up to support the family business. Sydney and Trey were working the younger, newly wealthy demographic near the premium open bar. Trey was pitching incredibly hard, a thin sheen of nervous sweat glistening on his forehead, despite the heavy air conditioning. He was desperate, handing out glossy leather-bound brochures for commercial developments that were currently locked down by my legal team. It is a closed-circle fund. Trey lied smoothly to a group of tech entrepreneurs, his smile tight and practiced. We are only opening up shares tonight for our most trusted network. The returns are fully guaranteed by Apex Holdings. It was a blatant, highly illegal misrepresentation. He was using the name of my own holding company to legitimize his fraud. Sydney stood firmly by his side, nodding enthusiastically, perfectly, playing the role of the supportive, wealthy wife. She chimed in to flatter the investors, expertly stroking egos to blind them to the missing financial disclosures. They thought they were completely safe. They thought the forged $2 million commercial loan I had consented to sign had bought them a golden ticket out of bankruptcy. They believed they had successfully extorted the family scapegoat and neutralized their only vulnerability. They had absolutely no idea that federal warrants had already been drafted and signed by a judge. They had no idea that my legal team had expedited the foreclosure documents to bypass the standard waiting periods. They had no idea that the very ground they were standing on was already crumbling beneath their expensive Italian leather shoes. As the evening progressed, the level of deception reached its peak. William tapped his champagne flute with a silver spoon, calling the room's attention to the main stage. The ambient chatter of the city's elite faded into a respectful hush as the string quartet ceased playing. William stepped up to the microphone, adjusting his silk tie, preparing to deliver the keynote pitch that he believed would permanently save his empire. We are standing on the precipice of a new era in commercial development, William announced, his deep, authoritative boardroom voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. Tonight is not just about real estate. It is about legacy. It is about trusting the people who have built this city from the ground up. He smiled warmly at the crowd, opening his arms in a grand gesture of manufactured goodwill. He spoke of integrity, of generational wealth, and of the unbreakable bonds of family business. Every word was a calculated lie designed to separate the attendees from their capital. Outside the ballroom, a fleet of black-armored SUVs pulled up to the front entrance of the Four Seasons, completely ignoring the valet queue. My security director, Marcus, stepped out first, coordinating the perimeter lockdown with rapid, silent efficiency. The hotel management was immediately informed of the situation by my legal representatives. There would be no interference from the hotel staff. The local authorities had already been briefed. Inside, William continued his speech, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride, completely oblivious to the shifting reality just beyond the heavy mahogany doors. We value loyalty above all else, William proclaimed, his eyes sweeping over the crowd of potential victims. We protect our investors just like we protect our own family. We ensure that every single person in our circle is elevated to the highest possible standard. And tonight, we invite you to join our family. The timing could not have been more poetic. Just as William finished his sentence, a heavy, palpable silence began to bleed into the back of the ballroom. The highly trained hotel staff instinctively stepped aside, pulling the heavy velvet curtains back from the entrance. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd of investors, socialites, and politicians, starting at the rear and rushing toward the front stage like a cold, unstoppable tidal wave. The doors open. Blair arrives, not as the disgraced dropout in a server's uniform, but wearing a breathtaking custom $15,000 Tom Ford gown flanked by elite private security. I crossed the threshold into the grand ballroom. The ambient chatter of 300 millionaires died instantly, replaced by a collective audible shift in the room's energy. My custom midnight blue Tom Ford gown caught the light of the crystal chandeliers overhead, the heavy silk cascading around me like liquid armor. Marcus and two other elite private security operatives flanked me, forming an impenetrable wedge that smoothly parted the sea of tuxedos and expensive ball gowns. People stared. They did not recognize the quiet, unremarkable middle child of the Wilson family. They saw a woman radiating absolute terrifying authority. From her position near the premium open bar, Diane noticed the sudden lull in conversation. Her eyes darted toward the entrance, searching the crowd for the source of the disruption. When her gaze finally landed on me, her crystal champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering sharply against the polished marble floor. The noise was abrupt but entirely ignored by the surrounding investors whose attention remained fixed on my arrival. Diane's manufactured high society grace evaporated in a fraction of a second. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She grabbed Sydney by the arm, her manicured nails digging deep into her favorite daughter's flesh, and the two of them shoved their way frantically through the crowd of wealthy socialites. They rushed the entrance, their designer heels clicking aggressively against the floorboards. They were entirely oblivious to the heavy, intimidating presence of my private security detail. Blinded by decades of ingrained arrogance, they only saw their designated punching bag daring to step foot inside their exclusive sanctuary. "Where did you rent that dress?" Diane hissed, her voice vibrating with venom as she aggressively closed the distance. She stopped inches from my security guards, her eyes frantically scanning the flawless, tailored cut of my gown. "Are you insane?" Diane demanded, her chest heaving. "You cannot be here. This is an exclusive investor gala, not a charity kitchen." Sydney stepped up beside her mother, her face twisting into an ugly, condescending sneer. "Take that fake jewelry off and get out the back door before Dad sees you." Sydney spat, her gaze lingering jealously on the diamond necklace resting against my collarbone. "You are going to humiliate us in front of the mayor." I did not blink. I did not take a single step back. I looked at them with the detached clinical interest of a scientist observing insects trapped in a jar. "You are trespassing." Diane continued, her voice rising in pitch, drawing the curious, bewildered stares of several nearby hedge fund managers. She turned frantically, waving her hand toward a group of hotel staff stationed near the lobby corridor. "Security, remove this lowlife. She is crashing a private corporate event." Diane crossed her arms, smiling triumphantly. She expected the hotel staff to leap into action. She expected me to shrink, to apologize, to scurry out the back exit, and return to the miserable, invisible existence they had assigned to me. Instead, the Four Seasons head of security, a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit with an earpiece, stepped forward from the shadows of the corridor. Diane stepped aside graciously, expecting him to grab my arm and drag me into the alleyway. The head of security did not look at me. He stepped smoothly and deliberately in front of Diane, forming a solid physical barrier between my mother and myself. "Ma'am," the head of security said, his voice firm, authoritative, and loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear clearly. "I am going to have to ask you to lower your voice and step back immediately." Diane froze, her jaw dropping in utter bewilderment. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "She is the intruder. Throw her out. Ma'am, please step back." The security chief repeated his tone, dropping an octave, leaving absolutely no room for debate. He placed a hand firmly on his radio. "Do not approach the VIP guest again." "VIP guest?" Sydney echoed, her voice cracking in pure, bewildered outrage. "She is my broke sister." Before Diane or Sydney could utter another frantic demand, the massive speakers positioned around the ballroom cracked to life with a sharp burst of static. On the main stage, William was standing frozen behind the oak podium. He had stopped his keynote pitch mid-sentence, his deep, authoritative boardroom voice dying in his throat as he watched the commotion unfolding at the main entrance. He squinted against the bright stage lights, trying to process the impossible sight of his estranged, supposedly destitute daughter, standing at the center of the ballroom, protected by elite guards and hotel management. Trey was standing just below the stage, his face entirely drained of color. He was looking at Marcus, recognizing the private security insignia from his frantic, doomed attempts to contact the corporate overlords who had frozen his accounts over the past week. A man in a sharp tuxedo stepped up to the podium, gently but firmly nudging William aside. It was the event's master of ceremonies who had been quietly intercepted by my legal team in the green room just 5 minutes prior, and handed a heavily revised script along with a very lucrative non-disclosure agreement. The MC tapped the microphone twice. The sharp percussive thumps echoed across the cavernous room, demanding absolute silence from the hundreds of attendees. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC announced, his professionally trained voice booming over the sound system, washing over the frozen, stunned crowd. "We have an unexpected and highly prestigious change to our evening's itinerary." William turned to the MC, his eyes wide with panic, silently demanding an explanation. The MC ignored him completely, keeping his gaze locked on the back of the room where I stood. "Please direct your attention to the entrance," the MC continued, gesturing broadly toward my location. "We are honored to welcome the sole financier of tonight's project." The words dropped into the ballroom like heavy stones. The crowd murmured, heads turning rapidly, bodies shifting to get a better look at the entrance. The investors William had spent the entire night lying to suddenly realized that the sweating pale man on the stage did not hold the purse strings. Diane stopped breathing. Her hand hovered in the air, trembling violently. Sydney stared at the MC, her mouth hanging open, unable to comprehend the words echoing through the room. "The CEO and founder of Apex Holdings." The MC finished, his voice rising to an enthusiastic crescendo. "Ms. Blair." A blinding, high-intensity spotlight instantly swiveled from the center stage, cutting through the dim ambiance of the ballroom to pin me against the heavy velvet curtains. The sheer brilliance of the beam illuminated the flawless silk of my Tom Ford gown, making the midnight blue fabric shimmer like a dark ocean. The applause began as a hesitant patter from the front row, initiated by a few eager tech developers who had recognized the Apex Holdings name. Within seconds, it erupted into a deafening roar. 300 of the city's most affluent investors, politicians, and socialites rose to their feet, clapping enthusiastically for the phantom billionaire who was supposedly injecting lifeblood into their portfolios. They parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, unobstructed runway leading directly to the main stage. At the front of the room, William stood absolutely petrified. His jaw hung slack, his complexion shifting rapidly from a flushed, arrogant crimson to a sickly, translucent gray. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his numb fingers. It hit the polished mahogany floor with a sharp, violent crash, sending glass shards and expensive vintage wine spraying across the toes of his handmade Italian leather shoes. He did not blink. He did not breathe. The realization that the destitute daughter he had just framed for grand larceny was the apex predator holding his entire corporate existence hostage was visibly short-circuiting his brain. Below him, Trey looked like he was going to vomit. He physically doubled over, clutching his stomach as a wave of pure, unadulterated panic swept through his nervous system. He staggered backward, bumping into a waiter's tray, sending Crystal tumbling to the carpet. His frantic eyes darted toward the side exits, searching for an escape route. My private security operatives were already there, their broad shoulders seamlessly blocking the heavy oak doors. Trey was trapped inside the slaughterhouse of his own making. Back at the entrance, Diane and Sydney remained frozen in shock. Diane's hand was still suspended in midair, pointing at me, trembling so violently, her diamond bracelets rattled. She stared at the custom gown, the elite security detail, and the undeniable reverence of the crowd. The horrifying truth fractured her manufactured reality. I was not wearing a rented dress. I was not crashing the event. I owned the event. Sydney's face crumpled into a mask of pale horror. The cruel smirk she had worn just hours ago at the country club vanished. The sudden understanding that she had ruthlessly mocked the very woman who now controlled her husband's federal fate caused her knees to buckle slightly. She grabbed her mother's arm to steady herself, completely unable to process the scale of their miscalculation. I stepped forward, moving with a slow, deliberate grace. Marcus and my security detail fell perfectly into step, fanning out slightly to maintain a sterile perimeter around me. The applause thundered in my ears, but the only sound that mattered was the steady, rhythmic click of my heels against the marble floor. As I navigated the central aisle, I made sure to meet the eyes of the people my father had just been aggressively hustling. I offered a polite, terrifyingly serene smile to the regional hedge fund manager William had been courting. I nodded graciously to the mayor, who quickly returned the gesture, eager to acknowledge the founder of Apex Holdings. They were completely captivated by the illusion of my partnership with the Wilson Empire, utterly blind to the execution I was about to perform. I reached the base of the stage. William was trembling now, the titan of industry, the man who had spent 3 decades crushing his competitors and emotionally pulverizing his own daughter, was shaking like a cornered animal. Sweat beaded on his upper lip, running down his ashen face to stain his stiff white collar. He tried to speak. He opened his mouth, desperately searching for a command, a threat, a lie to regain control of the room, but his vocal cords completely failed him. I placed my hand on the polished brass railing and gracefully walked up the grand staircase. Every step was a physical manifestation of the power shift. For 30 years he had looked down on me. He had banished me to the freezing snow. He had mocked my education, my career, and my independence. Now he was shrinking before my eyes, utterly powerless to stop his own public destruction. I stepped onto the platform and walked directly up to him. We were toe-to-toe under the blinding glare of the stage lights. The crowd's applause began to taper off, replaced by a thick, anticipatory silence. They expected a warm embrace. They expected a triumphant father-daughter photo opportunity. William stared at me, his chest heaving. His eyes darted frantically to the microphone, then back to my face. "Blair!" He choked out the word, barely a raspy whisper meant only for my ears. "What are you doing?" I did not answer him. I reached out and wrapped my hand around the neck of the microphone. William's grip was locked tight in a panic response, his knuckles white. I stared directly into his terrified eyes and smoothly, forcefully ripped the microphone from his paralyzed fingers. He stumbled awkwardly to the side, nearly tripping over the thick black cord, completely stripped of his authority. I turned to face the ballroom. The absolute silence was intoxicating. 300 pairs of eyes stared up at me, waiting for the promised announcement of unbridled wealth. The string quartet had vanished. Even the clinking of glasses at the bar had ceased entirely. I adjusted my grip on the microphone. My voice was calm, clear, and projected flawlessly across the expansive room. "Thank you all for being here," I said, my voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "But there has been a slight misunderstanding. I am not here to fund this project. I am here to collect a debt." The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, a fragile high-tension wire waiting to snap. I let my words hang in the chilled air, watching the realization slowly infect the faces of the investors standing nearest the stage. They were apex predators themselves, men and women who moved millions before their morning coffee, and they instantly recognized the scent of blood in the water. William opened his mouth, a sputtering, wordless sound escaping his throat. His perfectly tailored tuxedo suddenly looked 2 sizes too big, his broad shoulders collapsing under the invisible crushing weight of his impending doom. "Blair, what is this?" William hissed, taking a jagged step toward me, his face twisted in a panicked grimace. "Shut off that microphone right now." I did not look at him. I kept my gaze locked on the audience, raised my left hand, and snapped my fingers. The massive 60-foot LED presentation screens directly behind us flickered. The sleek computer-generated architectural renders of the Apex Zenith project, the fake glass towers meant to secure their fraudulent capital, vanished into blackness. In their place, stark high-resolution images flared to life, illuminating the entire stage in a harsh, unforgiving white glow. They were heavily redacted legal filings, but the critical information was undeniably clear, stamped with aggressive red ink that bled across the digital background. The first document displayed was a notice of immediate foreclosure. It was not a warning, it was a finalized execution order. The text detailed the exact parameters of the $10 million bridging loan William had secured using my stolen identity. Below the loan details, the collateral list was highlighted in a glaring neon yellow. His commercial plazas, the downtown high-rises, the sprawling Connecticut estate where I had spent my childhood being told I was insignificant and unworthy of the family name. All of it was legally defaulted directly to Apex Holdings. To me. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, sounding like a sudden gust of wind. Phones were instantly whipped out of expensive clutch purses and tuxedo pockets, camera flashes illuminating the room as hedge fund managers, rival developers, and local journalists documented the spectacular public execution of the Wilson empire. "No," William breathed, his voice trembling as he turned to read the towering screen behind him. He staggered backward, his hands grasping at his chest. "That is protected. The loan was guaranteed. The loan was fraudulent," I stated clearly into the microphone, my voice cutting cleanly through the rising, chaotic murmur of the ballroom. "Secured through systemic identity theft and wire fraud. That constitutes an immediate, unbreachable default of contract. Your entire portfolio is gone, William. You own absolutely nothing." Down on the floor, the crowd physically backed away from Diane and Sydney, as if they had suddenly become contagious. Diane was hyperventilating, her hands clawing at her own throat, her carefully constructed high society facade shattering into a million irreparable pieces. The women she had just been boasting to were now staring at her with undisguised revulsion and predatory glee. I snapped my fingers a second time. The screens shifted instantly. This time, the undeniable layout of a forensic accounting report flooded the displays. Rows of banking data, offshore routing numbers, and shell company transactions were mapped out with devastating precision graphics. "But we are not finished," I announced, turning my gaze to the grand staircase where Trey was frantically scrambling up the steps. He was desperately trying to reach the podium, his face slick with a cold, terrified sweat, clearly intending to rip the audio cables from the wall. Marcus stepped forward, his massive frame easily intercepting Trey at the top of the stairs, forcing the younger man to remain frozen on the edge of the stage. "For those of you in the audience who were considering investing your capital with Trey's private equity firm tonight," I continued, my tone clinical and exact. "You might want to review where his current clients' funds are actually residing." I pointed to the towering screen. Thick red arrows traced millions of dollars being siphoned directly from Trey's unregulated investment funds into personal offshore accounts held exclusively by Sydney. The itemized receipts were displayed for the entire city to see: $600,000 for a fleet of luxury SUVs, $2 million for the exact heirloom diamonds currently resting on my sister's neck and wrists. $3 million funneled into a shadow account in the Cayman Islands to hide his mounting catastrophic deficit. Sydney looked up at the screens, her face completely devoid of color. She grabbed the diamond necklace around her throat, looking as though the jewels were suddenly burning her skin. Trey Sydney shrieked from the floor, her voice cracking in pure, unadulterated panic, shattering the remaining decorum of the gala. "What is that?" "Tell them it is a lie." Trey could not speak. He was hyperventilating on the stage, his eyes darting wildly between the forensic report on the screen, the furious faces of the investors in the crowd, and my unyielding gaze. The investors who had already entrusted their money to Trey began to shout. The polite, refined gala immediately descended into raw, furious chaos. Men in tuxedos were yelling, surging toward the stage, demanding their funds and furiously dialing their attorneys. William slowly turned his head away from the foreclosure notice on the screen and looked at his son-in-law standing just feet away on the stage. The realization of what Trey had actually done hit the patriarch with the force of a derailed freight train. Trey had not just ruined himself, he had used William's favorite daughter and William's corporate network as a literal shield for his own sloppy embezzlement, accelerating the total, inescapable destruction of the family name. The carefully constructed, icy composure of the Wilson patriarch snapped entirely. The illusion of the sophisticated businessman was gone, replaced by the rabid, violent desperation of a man who had just lost his entire universe. William let out a guttural, furious roar that tore through his throat. He lunged at Trey on stage, screaming about the stolen money, the ruined legacy, and the ultimate betrayal. He tackled the younger man hard against the polished floorboards, his hands wrapping violently around Trey's collar as the two of them descended into a frantic, chaotic brawl under the glare of the stage lights. The crowd below surged backward, shouting in shock, the elegant launch gala dissolving into an absolute riot. I stood perfectly still, watching the physical manifestation of their boundless greed finally consume them. And then slicing cleanly through the screaming, the shattering glass, and the chaos inside the ballroom, The sharp, piercing blare of police sirens echoed outside the hotel walls, growing louder and closer by the second. The heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom did not simply open, they were violently breached. A swarm of federal agents and local police officers flooded the entrance, their dark tactical windbreakers cutting a stark, terrifying contrast against the glittering sea of haute couture. The synchronized stomp of heavy boots on the polished marble floor instantly drowned out the frantic, chaotic brawling on the stage. "FBI! Nobody move! Step away from the stage!" a voice boomed, amplified by a harsh megaphone that cut through the remaining ambient music. The city's elite, the hedge fund managers, the socialites, the politicians who had just been eagerly preparing to hand over their millions scattered like terrified insects. They backed away rapidly, pressing themselves against the silk-lined walls, desperate to physically distance themselves from the toxic epicenter of the Wilson family. Drinks were dropped, glasses shattered. The illusion of the high society gala evaporated into a scene of pure, unadulterated panic. 4 federal agents rushed the grand staircase, moving with absolute, uncompromising precision. William and Trey were still tangled on the floorboards, William's hands locked around Trey's throat in a desperate death grip. The agents did not ask politely. They physically tore the patriarch off his son-in-law, hauling William to his feet with a brutal lack of reverence. Trey scrambled backward, crab walking across the stage like a cornered rat. He hit the heavy oak podium, his eyes wide with blind terror as 2 agents converged on him. "Get your hands off me! I did not do it!" "It was his company," Trey shrieked, pointing a shaking, cowardly finger directly at William. "He forced me to hide the collateral. I can give you everything on him. I want immunity." His frantic deflection was entirely useless. An agent grabbed Trey by the shoulder, spinning him around forcefully and slamming him hard against the podium. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around Trey's wrists echoed sharply over the stunned silence of the ballroom. The Golden Boy equity manager who had just been pitching guaranteed returns was now weeping openly against the mahogany stand. William, meanwhile, was actively fighting against the agents restraining his arms. His face was purple with rage and indignation. 30 years of untouchable privilege made him entirely incapable of processing his own arrest. "Do you have any idea who I am?" William bellowed, his voice raw and ragged spittle flying from his lips. "I am William Wilson. I built this city. I will have your badges for this. I will sue the federal government into the ground." The lead FBI agent, a tall woman with an expression of absolute stone, stepped directly into William's line of sight. She did not flinch at his roaring. She simply pulled a thick, laminated warrant from her tactical jacket and held it up to his face. "William Wilson, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive bank fraud, and federal extortion," the agent stated, her voice projecting clearly to the hundreds of silent watching guests. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The clinical, emotionless recitation of his Miranda rights was the final fatal blow. The words seemed to physically crush William. His broad chest deflated. The fight instantly drained out of him, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, broken shell of a man. His legs buckled, and the agents had to actively support his weight as they secured his wrists behind his back. He looked out at the audience, his eyes pleading for a single ally among the billionaires he had called friends. The hedge fund managers simply turned their backs. The titan of industry was gone, replaced by an aging, disgraced criminal. On the floor below the stage, Sydney was becoming hysterical. 2 female officers had approached her, presenting a separate warrant for the seizure of assets purchased with embezzled client funds. Sydney shrieked as an officer instructed her to remove the $2 million heirloom diamond necklace, the matching tennis bracelets, and the heavy emerald ring she had been flaunting all evening. "You cannot take these. They are mine. My husband bought them for me," Sydney wailed, clutching the jewels to her chest as if they were her own children. "Your husband bought them with stolen money, ma'am," the officer replied coldly, extending a clear evidence bag. "Hand them over immediately, or you will be arrested for obstruction of a federal investigation." Sydney dissolved into an ugly, hyperventilating mess, fumbling with the intricate clasps of the diamonds with shaking fingers. She dropped the glittering stones into the officer's plastic pouch, watching her entire identity, built purely on stolen wealth and projected superiority, vanish into evidence. She collapsed into a nearby chair, burying her ruined makeup in her hands, her wails echoing through the cavernous room. I stood completely still, watching the meticulous dismantling of the perfect family. My security detail maintained their tight perimeter around me, untouched by the chaos unfolding just feet away. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt only the cold, clinical satisfaction of a surgical strike successfully executed. They had built their fragile empire on decades of emotional abuse, endless lies, and the deliberate exploitation of my own identity. I had simply handed the hammer to the authorities. The crowd of elite guests watched the spectacle in absolute horrified silence. Cell phone cameras were still rolling, capturing every humiliating second of the Wilson family's destruction. By tomorrow morning, the unedited footage would be plastered across every major financial news network on the globe. Their social death was absolute and irreversible. The very people they had tried to swindle tonight would now actively celebrate their ruin. As the federal agents began to march William and Trey down the grand staircase toward the exit, Diane finally snapped. The shock that had paralyzed her completely shattered, replaced by a raw, primal desperation. Her husband was in handcuffs. Her golden son-in-law was a convicted embezzler. Her favorite daughter was sobbing, stripped of her stolen jewels. Her mansion, her country club membership, her entire manufactured existence had just been legally incinerated. She realized in a flash of terrifying clarity that there was only one person in the room who held any power. Diane shoved past a bewildered city councilman and sprinted toward me. Her manicured facade was entirely gone. Her expensive updo was falling apart, strands of hair sticking to her tear-streaked face. Marcus stepped forward to intercept her, raising his arm to block her path, but I held up a single finger, signaling him to stand down. I wanted to see this. I wanted to feel the absolute weight of her surrender. Diane did not stop to reason. She did not attempt to negotiate or maintain her dignity. The woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was worthless, insignificant, and a profound disappointment completely collapsed. Diane falls to her knees in her designer gown, grabbing Blair's ankles. "Blair, please. Tell them it's a mistake. We are your blood, have mercy on your family." The grip on my ankles was surprisingly strong. Diane's knuckles were white, her diamond-encrusted fingers digging into the silk of my gown. She was weeping with a complete lack of restraint, her expensive mascara running in dark, jagged tracks down her pale cheeks. The woman who had spent 30 years cultivating an image of untouchable aristocratic elegance was now begging on the floor of a ballroom, surrounded by the very people she had considered her peers. The hypocrisy of her plea hung heavily in the chilled air. She invoked the concept of blood and family as if those words held any currency between us. As if they were a magical incantation that could erase decades of systematic emotional abuse and financial exploitation. I stared down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. There was no pity, no residual daughterly affection, and certainly no mercy. I looked down at my mother, gently kicking my heel free from Diane's grasp. She slumped forward onto the polished floorboards, her hands grasping at empty air. "Remember when you threw my suitcase in the snow?" I asked, my voice deadly calm and perfectly leveled, ensuring the surrounding crowd heard every single syllable. "Remember when Dad told me to get out, you lowlife? You made it very clear, Diane. Uneducated trash doesn't have a family." Diane gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as the exact words she had weaponized against me on that freezing winter night were thrown back into her face. The surrounding socialites and investors murmured, their phones still aimed directly at her, recording her ultimate humiliation for the morning society pages. She looked up at me, searching my eyes for a fraction of the scared, desperate girl they had banished. She found nothing but the architect of her ruin. Before Diane could formulate another pathetic plea, the heavy thud of tactical boots drew my attention to the right side of the stage. Sydney was already hyperventilating in a chair, rubbing her bare wrists where the confiscated diamond bracelets had been. She was watching her husband Trey being dragged toward the freight elevators by two federal agents, sobbing hysterically. She assumed the worst was over. She assumed she was simply the tragic wife of a disgraced equity manager. She was entirely wrong. A female FBI agent, her face set in a stern, unyielding mask, marched directly past Diane and came to a halt right in front of Sydney. "Sydney Wilson, stand up." The agent commanded, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the ruined gala. Sydney recoiled, pressing herself deep into the upholstery of the chair. "Why, I gave you the jewelry. I did not do anything. Trey handled the accounts." The agent did not argue. She reached down, grabbed Sydney firmly by the bicep, and hauled her to her feet with a swift, practiced motion. Sydney shrieked, batting wildly at the agent's arm, but her resistance was entirely futile. The agent spun Sydney around, forcing her arms behind her back with a sharp, violent twist. "You are under arrest for federal identity theft, wire fraud, and the criminal forgery of a social security number," the agent stated, retrieving a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from her belt. Sydney's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror as the realization crashed into her. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, the ones Trey had set up to hide the embezzled funds, required a clean, untraceable guarantor. Sydney had willingly provided my stolen social security number and forged my signature on the federal banking forms to secure their stolen wealth. She had assumed I was a nameless, destitute ghost who would never discover the fraud. "I did not know. Trey told me to sign it." Sydney screamed, her voice cracking as the cold steel snapped shut around her wrists, locking her in place. "Mom, tell them I did not know it was federal fraud." Diane could only watch from the floor, paralyzed by shock, as her favorite daughter, the golden child who had spent her entire life mocking my ambitions, was aggressively marched toward the exit like a common street criminal. Sydney kicked and thrashed her designer heels, slipping on the marble, crying out for a rescue that was never coming. I turned my back on them. The execution was complete. I gave a sharp nod to Marcus. My private security detail instantly formed a tight protective wedge around me. We moved down the central aisle of the ballroom, leaving the wreckage of the Wilson Empire behind us. The crowd of investors, the elite predators who had been eagerly writing checks just an hour ago, parted instantly. They pressed themselves against the walls, lowering their eyes as I walked past. They were completely terrified, understanding clearly that the woman they had dismissed as a background character possessed the power to dismantle a 30-year corporate dynasty in a single evening. We exited the ballroom, navigating the long corridor leading to the hotel lobby. The heavy brass doors of the Four Seasons swung open, and the freezing night air hit my face, crisp and incredibly refreshing. The street outside was a scene of absolute cinematic chaos. Half a dozen police cruisers and unmarked federal SUVs blocked the intersection, their red and blue lights painting the surrounding skyscrapers in a frantic, pulsating rhythm. Local news vans were already parked haphazardly on the sidewalks, their satellite dishes raised, and reporters swarming the police barricades with microphones thrust high into the air. I stopped at the top of the grand granite stairs, standing perfectly still under the awning, and watched the finale unfold. The hotel doors were shoved open. William was hauled out first, flanked by two massive federal agents. The moment he stepped into the freezing air, the blinding strobe of 50 camera flashes erupted simultaneously. The proud titan of industry, the man who had brutally banished me to the snow, was shoved roughly into the back of a squad car, his head pushed down by an officer to clear the doorframe. He kept his face buried in his cuffed hands, hiding from the very journalists he used to court. Trey was paraded out next, his face slick with tears, openly weeping, as reporters shouted questions about the missing millions. Sydney followed, aggressively fighting the agents, guiding her, screaming obscenities at the flashing cameras, her mascara smeared across her face, completely stripped of her high society grace. Diane trailed behind the procession. She was not handcuffed, but she was utterly destroyed. She stumbled out into the cold night air, shivering violently in her thin designer gown. She desperately pulled a ruined silk shawl over her head, trying to shield herself from the blinding camera flashes and the vicious, probing questions of the press. They were paraded in front of the entire city, their legacy of arrogance, theft, and cruelty broadcast live for the world to witness. I stood at the top of the stairs, breathing in the cold winter air, completely untouched by their ruin. I had built my empire in the shadows, and I had used it to drag them into the unforgiving light. The morning after the gala, the Wilson name was completely radioactive. I sat in my pristine corner office at Apex Holdings, sipping a perfectly brewed espresso, while watching the financial news networks dissect my family's spectacular implosion. The footage of William being shoved into a police cruiser played on an endless looping broadcast across every major channel. Anchors who had previously praised his business acumen were now aggressively tearing him apart, exposing the fraudulent foundations of his crumbling empire. The fallout was incredibly swift and utterly merciless. Investors scrambled to pull whatever untainted capital remained in Wilson Enterprises. The board of directors convened an emergency 3 o'clock morning meeting to officially vote my father out as CEO. By sunrise, they had scrubbed his image, his biography, and his name from their corporate website. The empire he had proudly sacrificed his own daughter to build dissolved into digital dust before he even made bail. The federal justice system moves with a terrifying, crushing efficiency when high-profile SEC violations and wire fraud are involved. Trey's boutique private equity firm was immediately raided and liquidated by government regulators. His high-priced defense attorneys, realizing the sheer volume and undeniable clarity of the digital evidence I had handed over, quickly advised him to abandon any hope of a trial. He took a plea deal hoping for a shred of mercy, but the massive scale of the embezzlement offered absolutely no leniency. I attended his sentencing hearing 4 weeks later, sitting quietly in the back row of the heavily guarded federal courthouse. Trey looked unrecognizable. He was stripped of his bespoke Italian suits, wearing a standard-issue drab orange prison jumpsuit, his skin a sickly pallid gray. The judge was completely merciless, citing his gross abuse of fiduciary duty and predatory behavior. He handed down a mandatory 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. As the bailiff stepped forward to secure his chains, Trey completely lost his mind. He violently shoved his chair back, the heavy wood screeching against the floor, and lunged toward the gallery where Sydney sat trembling. He screamed that she was a parasite, that her insatiable superficial greed had dug his grave, violently cursing her name until the heavy courtroom doors slammed shut behind him. Sydney did not fare much better in the aftermath. While she narrowly avoided a lengthy prison sentence by aggressively turning state's witness against her own husband, the professional and financial devastation she faced was absolute. The State Bar Association convened an emergency disciplinary panel within days of the arrest. Based on her direct, undeniable involvement in the Social Security forgery and federal wire fraud, she was permanently disbarred. Her license to practice law was publicly revoked, permanently stripping her of the elite career she had constantly rubbed in my face. Then came the brutal reality of asset forfeiture. Federal agents descended upon her custom-built, multi-million-dollar townhouse, executing a sweeping court-ordered seizure to restitute the defrauded investors. I parked my town car across the street, watching through tinted glass as moving crews hauled out her imported velvet furniture, her curated modern art collection, and the keys to her matching luxury vehicles. Sydney stood on the sidewalk in a plain gray sweatshirt, weeping uncontrollably as agents boxed up her designer shoes and handbags. She was left standing on the curb, holding nothing but a single canvas duffel bag, containing basic clothing, her entire elite identity completely erased. But the true crowning climax of my vengeance involved the Connecticut estate. The sprawling 10-bedroom mansion with its manicured rose gardens and sweeping circular driveways was the physical manifestation of William and Diane's perceived superiority. It was the fortress where they had emotionally starved me and locked me out in the cold. The foreclosure proceeded with brutal, undeniable speed. With all his personal and corporate accounts frozen by the FBI, William had absolutely no capital to fight the default. Apex Holdings officially took possession of the deed on a cold, rainy Tuesday morning. I did not send a proxy or an attorney to handle the eviction. I went myself. I walked through the grand double doors, flanked by 2 armed local sheriffs and my lead corporate counsel. William and Diane were standing in the grand foyer, looking decades older than they had just a month prior. William's face was hollowed out, his broad shoulders permanently stooped under the weight of his disgrace. Diane was weeping silently, clutching a single framed photograph of a family that no longer existed. They were given exactly 30 minutes to vacate the premises. I looked down at my mother, gently kicking my heel free from Diane's grasp. "Remember when you threw my suitcase in the snow?" I asked, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Remember when Dad told me to get out, you lowlife?" "You made it very clear, Diane. Uneducated trash doesn't have a family." I stood in the exact spot by the grand staircase where William had banished me years ago, silently watching him struggle to carry 2 cheap borrowed suitcases out his own front door. He did not look at me. He simply stared at the floor, utterly broken by the reality that his discarded daughter was now the legal owner of his entire legacy. With their assets entirely seized, their credit scores obliterated, and their wealthy country club friends completely ghosting them, William and Diane had absolutely nowhere left to turn. They were radioactive toxic waste in a city that exclusively worshipped status and wealth. That evening, my private investigator sent me a final, highly anticipated photograph. It showed William and Diane dragging their meager luggage across the cracked, weed-infested asphalt of a motel parking lot. The flickering neon sign above them illuminated a rundown, roach-infested weekly rental. I smiled as I zoomed in on the street sign visible in the corner of the frame. It was located in the exact same low-income industrial neighborhood they used to relentlessly mock me for living in during my struggling years. Exactly 1 month had passed since that final pathetic photograph of the motel parking lot arrived in my encrypted inbox. I stood on the sprawling wraparound terrace of my $8 million Manhattan penthouse, letting the icy, bracing wind of the upper atmosphere wash over my face. The city stretched out infinitely below me, a glittering, pulsing grid of gold and white lights that cut through the darkness. The ambient heat lamps recessed into the sleek wooden ceiling of the balcony kept the immediate area perfectly warm, creating a comfortable barrier against the biting chill of the impending winter. Down on the street level, the traffic was a silent river of red taillights and white headlights. I swirled the dark, heavy Cabernet in my crystal glass, watching the rich liquid coat the sides. The absolute pristine tranquility of my high-rise sanctuary provided a stark, beautiful contrast to the chaotic, filthy reality my parents were currently enduring in their roadside purgatory. On the frosted glass table beside me, my private smartphone vibrated abruptly. The screen illuminated the darkness, displaying a rapid succession of notifications. They were incoming voicemails from a string of unregistered prepaid numbers. Burner phones. It was the only conceivable way they could bypass the ironclad block my corporate security team had placed on their original, now disconnected cellular accounts. I did not pick up the device. I simply stood there taking a slow sip of the expensive wine and watched the automated voicemail transcript scroll across the lock screen in real time. "Blair, please," the first transcription read, capturing Diane's frantic, high-pitched sobbing in stark black text. "The heater in this room is completely broken. There is black mold growing on the bathroom walls. We have not eaten anything but cold canned soup in 3 days. Please just send a car for us. You cannot leave your own mother in a place like this." A second message immediately populated below it, this one from William. His text was disjointed, his former booming, arrogant authority reduced to a pathetic, raspy whimper. "Blair, I need a loan. Just $5,000. 1,000. Anything." The federal agents froze the last of my emergency cash reserves. "The manager here is threatening to throw us out onto the street by Friday morning. You won the war. You proved your point. Please have some mercy on your father." I read the words as they formed on the glowing glass, analyzing their structure with the exact same clinical detachment I used to review failing software code. There was absolutely no apology hidden in their desperate pleas. There was no recognition of the decades of psychological torment they had inflicted upon me, nor any accountability for the wire fraud, the emotional abuse, and the identity theft that had legally put them in that roach-infested motel. They were only sorry that they had finally been caught. They were only crying because the freezing, hungry reality I had survived for years was now their inescapable daily existence. 30 days ago, hearing my father beg for money might have provoked a fierce, vindictive spike of adrenaline. A decade ago, hearing my mother cry would have sent me rushing to her side, desperate to earn the maternal love she constantly and strategically withheld. Tonight, staring at the digital proof of their suffering, I felt absolutely nothing. The toxic emotional tether that had bound me to their suffocating orbit was completely and permanently severed. The invisible crushing weight I had carried in my chest since childhood, the desperate need to prove my fundamental worth to people incapable of recognizing it, had vanished. They were no longer the terrifying omnipotent titans of my youth. They were just two broke, desperate criminals screaming into a void they had dug with their own greedy hands. The phone vibrated a third time. Another burner number flashed on the screen. Another frantic plea for unearned salvation was attempting to breach my peace. I reached out and picked up the sleek metal device. I did not unlock it. I did not bother reading the newest transcript. My thumb found the power button on the side of the casing. I held it down firmly, watching the bright screen dim, flicker, and fade entirely to black. The device went dead, cutting off their voices, their panic, and their pathetic existence from my world permanently. I tossed the deactivated phone onto a nearby lounge chair. It landed with a soft, muted thud, completely stripped of its power to interrupt my life. I raised the crystal glass to my lips and took another slow, deliberate sip of the vintage wine. The rich, complex flavors exploded on my tongue, grounding me in the present moment. I turned away from the sprawling city skyline and walked back inside through the towering glass sliding doors. The interior of my penthouse was a masterpiece of minimalist design and high-tech efficiency. The living space was vast and uncluttered, entirely free from the heavy, oppressive antiques and suffocating generational expectations that had choked the air in my parents' Connecticut estate. Here, every surface was clean, purposeful, and entirely mine. I walked past the expansive marble kitchen island and headed directly for the customized workspace dominating the far wall of the open-concept loft. This was my true sanctuary. A curved, custom-built desk held a seamless array of 4 ultra-high-definition monitors. The screens were currently dormant, displaying a stark black background waiting for my command. I set my wine glass down on a heated coaster and sank into the ergonomic leather chair. The soft material yielded perfectly to my posture. I tapped the spacebar on my mechanical keyboard, and the entire workstation instantly flared to life. Lines of complex, elegant algorithms populated the center screens at lightning speed. It was the foundational architecture for Apex Holdings' next major venture, a revolutionary artificial intelligence predictive model designed to identify and dismantle fraudulent shell corporations in global financial markets. It was a multi-million-dollar project, infinitely more sophisticated and lucrative than the simple digital trap I had built to snare Trey and William. I rested my hands on the keys, feeling the cool, textured plastic beneath my fingertips. The silence of the penthouse was absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic hum of the high-performance servers running silently beneath the desk. There were no cruel voices telling me I was uneducated. There were no arrogant sneers about my wardrobe or my background. There was no one attempting to claim credit for my intellect or steal the capital I had bled to generate. For the first time in 30 years, the air in my lungs belonged entirely to me. I stared at the blinking cursor at the end of a command line. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was not the tight, guarded smirk of a woman preparing for a brutal battle, but the relaxed, radiant expression of a woman who had decisively won the war. I pressed my fingers down against the mechanical keys and began to code, building the first layer of my new empire in total, unadulterated freedom. The power of reclaiming your narrative. The most profound lesson from Blair's journey is that true empowerment comes from within. When the people who should protect you choose to exploit you instead, we often allow those toxic dynamics to dictate our self-worth. However, Blair proves that your origins do not define your destiny. By quietly investing in her own independence and severing emotional tethers to her abusers, she built an unbreakable sanctuary. Her ultimate victory wasn't just their downfall, it was reclaiming her narrative and discovering her inherent value. Have you ever walked away from a toxic environment to find your true strength? Share your experiences in the comments below.